At around 1:45 in the morning, on the 13th of October 1984, a 20-year-old college student named Angela Samota made a phone call from her Dallas apartment to her boyfriend. She sounded off, nervous. He could hear something in the background, and she told him something that, in the moment, sounded almost ordinary, and in hindsight is the most chilling sentence in this entire case. She told him she had let a man into her apartment, a stranger, to use the bathroom and the phone. She said she'd call him right back. She hung up, and she never called back. When her boyfriend couldn't reach her, he grew uneasy and went to her apartment to check on her. By the time anyone understood what had happened, Angela Samota, a bright, ambitious young woman with her whole life in front of her, had been attacked and killed in her own home. The man had left his DNA behind, on her body and under her fingernails, because she had fought him with everything she had. But this was 1984. DNA, as a tool that could take a smear of biological evidence and turn it into a name, did not yet exist. So the most important evidence in the case was, for the moment, useless. The leads dried up. An innocent man fell under a cloud of suspicion that would follow him for years, and the murder of Angela Samota went cold. If cases like this one are why you're here, the ones where the evidence sat waiting for decades until someone refused to give up, subscribe to Decades Cold, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. This is exactly what we do here. And here is what makes this case different from almost every other one we've told. This case was not ultimately cracked by a detective. It was not cracked by a task force, or a tip line, or a lucky break in an interrogation room. It was cracked by Angela's best friend, her college roommate, an ordinary woman with a husband and children and no background in law enforcement, who could not accept that Angie's killer was going to walk free. Over the years that followed, that friend turned her own home into a command center, called the Dallas police so many times they eventually assigned a detective just to get her to stop, and then, when that still wasn't enough, went out and became a licensed private investigator herself, for the single purpose of solving this one murder. This is the story of Angela Samota. It's the story of the friend who would not quit. And it's the story of the small human act of kindness that a predator turned into a weapon. To the people who loved her, she was Angie. Angela Marie Samota was 20 years old, the youngest of 5 children. And by every account, she was the kind of person who made a room brighter just by being in it. She was a junior at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, and she was studying something that, in 1984, almost no young women were studying: computer science and electrical engineering. Think about that for a second. In the early 1980s, in those fields, she would often have been one of very few women, sometimes the only one, in the room. That takes a particular kind of confidence and intelligence and stubbornness, and Angie had all three. She was, in every sense, ahead of her time. The people who knew her described someone bright and warm and full of life, genuinely kind, the kind of friend who would go out of her way for you. That kindness matters enormously in this story, and I want to plant it here at the start, because the cruelest thing about what happened to Angie is that her killer used her own goodness against her. She was the sort of person who would open a door for a stranger who seemed to need help, and that instinct, which is one of the most decent things a person can have, is exactly the instinct a predator counts on. She had a boyfriend, Ben. She had a tight circle of friends, and she had a best friend from her freshman year, a young woman named Sheila, who had been randomly assigned as her roommate at SMU in 1982. The two of them clicked immediately. Sheila would later describe it almost as fate. Two young women who were different in a lot of ways, but who had come from similar family situations, both of them having lost their fathers, and that shared understanding pulled them close. They were, in Sheila's word, inseparable. Remember that friendship, because it is the thread that runs through this entire case, and in the end, it is the thread that solves it. In the fall of 1984, Angie had every reason to believe her life was just beginning. She had the degree in sight, in a field with a wide-open future. She had people who loved her. She had, in front of her, the ordinary and extraordinary decades that everyone assumes they'll get, and all of it was taken from her on a single October night by a stranger she was kind enough to let in. The night of October 12, 1984, was, for most of its length, a completely ordinary good night. Angie went out with friends. They ended up at a Dallas club called the Rio Room, where they danced and had drinks into the early hours. It was the kind of night a 20-year-old is supposed to have. Friends, music, the easy freedom of being young in a city. When the night wound down, Angie did what a good friend does. She drove her friends home. Then she stopped by her boyfriend Ben's place to say goodnight. And then she drove home, alone, to her own apartment. Everything up to that point was unremarkable. Safe. The ordinary end of an ordinary good night. It's the part that comes next that has haunted everyone connected to this case for 40 years. At around 1:45 in the morning, Ben's phone rang. It was Angie, and right away something was wrong. Her voice was off, nervous, uneasy in a way he wasn't used to. And in the background he could hear something, some sound he couldn't place. Angie explained, there was a man at her apartment, a stranger. She'd let him in, she said, because he needed to use the bathroom and the phone. And then she told Ben she'd call him right back, and she hung up. Ben waited for the call back. It didn't come. He tried to reach her and couldn't. And that quiet dread that any of us would feel began to build. The sense that something was wrong that you can't yet name. Unable to shake it, Ben went to Angie's apartment. And in doing so, he became the person who found the aftermath and the person who alerted the police. Whatever had made Angie nervous on that phone call had been real. The stranger she'd been kind enough to let inside had not left. And in the time between that call and Ben's arrival, he had murdered her. What the police found when they arrived was a horrific scene, and I'm going to describe it only as much as the case requires and no further, because Angie deserves that restraint. She had been sexually assaulted, and she had been stabbed to death. The violence was extreme. It was so brutal, in fact, that it left a lasting impression on the officers and investigators who responded, the kind of scene that people carry for the rest of their careers. But even in the middle of that horror, Angie left investigators something, because she did not go quietly. She fought. We know she fought because of the physical evidence her struggle produced. There was biological evidence at the scene, blood, and material recovered from the sexual assault, and, critically, material under her fingernails. Fingernail evidence is the signature of someone who fought back hard, who clawed and grabbed at her attacker, who fought for her life with her bare hands. In that struggle, Angie took a piece of her killer with her. His DNA was on her, and under her nails, and left behind at the scene. And here is the tragedy of timing that defines the first chapter of this case. In October of 1984, that biological evidence was, in practical terms, close to worthless as an identification tool. DNA profiling, the science of reading a genetic code from a sample and matching it to a specific human being, was in its earliest infancy and was not yet a usable forensic method in a case like this. So the police had, sitting in their evidence, the killer's own genetic signature, a perfect, unique identifier that pointed at exactly one man on Earth. And they had no way to read it, no way to match it, no database to run it against. Angie had fought hard enough to capture her killer's identity in the most literal biological sense, and the science of the day simply could not yet decode what she'd captured. It would take more than 2 decades and one relentless friend before that evidence could finally speak. When a young woman is murdered in her own home with no obvious break-in, investigators naturally look first at the people in her life. And in the early days, that included the men around her. Her boyfriend Ben, the young man who had found her and called the police, was scrutinized, as people close to a victim almost always are. But there was another man who fell under the shadow of this case and stayed there for years, and his story is an important part of why this case matters. His name was Russell Buchanan. He had crossed paths with Angie's world, and in the investigation that followed, suspicion settled on him. And once suspicion settles on a person in an unsolved murder, it can be very hard to shake, even without a charge, even without proof. Buchanan lived for years under a cloud, quietly suspected by some of being connected to a brutal murder he had absolutely nothing to do with. That is one of the quieter cruelties of a cold case. It doesn't just deny justice to the victim. It can leave an innocent person trapped under a permanent, unspoken accusation, unable to fully clear their name, because the only thing that could definitively clear them, the truth, hasn't surfaced yet. This is a pattern we've seen before on this channel, and it's worth pausing on every time because it cuts against a comfortable assumption people have, the idea that if the police suspect you, you probably did something. Sometimes the person under suspicion is simply the person who was nearby, or who fit a theory, or who couldn't prove where they were. And when the real evidence, the physical, biological, unarguable evidence, finally gets the tools it needs, it doesn't only catch the guilty, it frees the innocent. Russell Buchanan's name would eventually be cleared completely by the very same DNA that would name the real killer. But he had to wait a very long time for that day, carrying a weight he never earned. Meanwhile, the actual investigation stalled. The DNA couldn't be used, the leads ran out, and the murder of Angela Samota slid into the vast, quiet category of the unsolved, where most cases, once they land there, stay forever. Most cases don't have a Sheila Wysocki. When Angie was murdered, it did not only end her life, it detonated the lives of the people who loved her. And no one was more shattered, or more permanently changed, than her best friend and former roommate, Sheila Wysocki. Sheila had been at her own mother's house the night Angie was killed. She learned about the murder the way people learn the worst news, a phone call, and then the floor dropping out of the world. She has described it in stark terms, that the murder happened, and her entire sense of life and security simply crumbled. She didn't go back to finish at SMU. How could she? The place, the routine, the ordinary future she'd imagined, all of it was now inseparable from the loss of her closest friend. For most people, grief like that eventually settles into something you carry quietly for the rest of your life, a dull, permanent ache. You don't get over it, but you learn to live alongside it. Sheila did carry it. For years, she carried it the way most of us would, privately, painfully, at a distance from the case itself. She built a life, she married, she had children, she moved to Tennessee. On the outside, life went on, the way life insists on going on. But underneath, something never resolved, because the central fact of Angie's death was that no one had ever answered for it. The person who did it was out there, unnamed, unpunished, free. And a part of Sheila could not, would not, make peace with that. She has described a turning point that came years later. A night when, doing some quiet reading at home, she felt overwhelmingly that Angie was present with her, and that the message was unmistakable. The case had to be reopened. You can interpret a moment like that however you choose. What matters is what she did with it, because from that point on, Sheila Wysocki stopped being a grieving friend at a distance, and became something the Dallas Police Department had almost certainly never dealt with before, and would not soon forget. What Sheila Wysocki did next is, honestly, one of the most remarkable things I've ever gotten to describe on this channel. She decided, as a private citizen with no law enforcement background, that she was going to get her best friend's 20-year-old murder solved, and then she actually did it. She started by turning her family's study into what she called a war room. She began gathering everything she could, pulling reports of rapes and assaults from the same era and the same area, trying to build, on her own, the kind of pattern analysis a cold case unit would build. She had obstacles most people wouldn't push through. She has spoken about living with dyslexia, which made the mountains of paperwork even harder. None of it stopped her. And then she started calling the Dallas police. Not once, not a dozen times. By her own account, she called them so relentlessly, so persistently, over so long a period, that the department eventually assigned a detective to the case, in part just to get her to stop calling. She has said it herself, with a kind of dark humor, that they reopened it because they were sick and tired of hearing from her. But she didn't just nag. This is the part that elevates it from a devoted friend making phone calls into something genuinely extraordinary. Sheila went out and became a licensed private investigator. Not as a career move. She had no interest at the time in being a PI. She got the license for one reason and one reason only, so that she would have the standing, the credibility, and the tools to push this specific case forward. She refused to let Angie become just another file in a dusty box in an evidence room somewhere, forgotten by a system that had moved on. She made herself impossible to ignore. Think about what that actually requires. Decades after the murder. A family of her own to raise. No obligation to do any of this, except the obligation of love. And instead of letting go, which everyone would have understood, which most people would have done, she doubled down and built an entire second identity around the single goal of getting justice for a friend who had been dead for 20 years. She forced a system that had given up to pay attention again. And that is the thing that cracked this case. Not luck, not a coincidence. The refusal of one person to let the world forget. Sheila's relentlessness did what it was designed to do. The Dallas Police Department reopened the Samota case, and in the mid-2000s it landed on the desk of a detective named Linda Crum. And now, finally, the two things this case had always needed were in the same place at the same time. Someone determined to work it, and a science advanced enough to make the old evidence speak. Because here is the crucial fact, the fact that makes this whole solve possible. The biological evidence from 1984 had been preserved. The blood, the material from the sexual assault, the evidence from under Angie's fingernails where she'd fought her attacker. All of it had been kept, sitting in storage for more than 20 years, waiting for a future that had finally arrived. As Sheila herself put it, they had Angie's fingernails, which meant they had DNA. They had the evidence from the assault, which meant they had DNA. The killer's genetic signature had been in that evidence room the entire time. What had changed was not the evidence. What had changed was the world's ability to read it. Detective Crum took that preserved DNA and did the thing that had been impossible in 1984. She had it analyzed into a full genetic profile, and then she ran that profile against databases of people with criminal records, the systems that now hold the DNA of people who have been convicted of qualifying crimes. This is the workhorse of the modern cold case, not the exotic family tree genealogy we've covered in other episodes, but the more direct version. Take the killer's DNA and check it against everyone the system has already collected, and see if the person is already in there. And in this case, the answer to that question was yes. The killer was in the system. He had been in the system, in fact, for a very long time. In 2008, the comparison produced a match. After 24 years, the genetic signature Angie had captured under her fingernails as she fought for her life finally had a name attached to it. And the name belonged to a man who had been sitting in a Texas prison for years. The DNA matched a man named Donald Andrew Bess Jr., and once investigators had that name, the pieces of who he was assembled into a genuinely chilling picture. Bess was born in 1948, which made him around 36 years old at the time Angie was murdered in 1984, and he was not a stranger to the criminal justice system. Far from it. Here is the detail that lands like a punch. At the time he murdered Angela Samota, Donald Bess was out on parole. He had been serving a lengthy sentence and he had been released, walking free into the community for only a matter of months. When Angie let a stranger into her apartment to use the phone, and then, roughly a year after Angie's murder, Bess was sent back to prison, convicted in a separate case of aggravated sexual assault and related crimes, and sentenced to life. He was, in short, a serial rapist, a repeat, violent sexual predator, who had been let out on parole, who committed this murder during that window of freedom, and who was then locked back up for a different attack, and who had been sitting in a Texas prison, serving life, for the entire time the Samota case sat cold. Let that sink in, because it compounds the tragedy in a specific way. For much of the time that Angie's case was unsolved, her killer was already behind bars. He was already identified, already in custody, already in the state's system, just not connected to her murder. If the DNA could have been read and matched sooner, he would have been named years earlier. The only thing standing between Donald Bess and a murder charge, for 2 decades, was the technology to read the evidence Angie had left behind, and someone willing to push hard enough to make it happen. And the same DNA match did something else, quietly, that matters enormously. It cleared Russell Buchanan. The innocent man who had lived under the shadow of this case for years was, at last, definitively and scientifically excluded. The truth that freed him was the same truth that condemned Bess. That is the double power of physical evidence when it's finally read correctly. In a single result, It can lift an unjust suspicion off one man's shoulders and drop the full weight of guilt onto the person who actually earned it. Now, with a name and a face attached to the DNA, go back to that phone call. Go back to 1:45 in the morning, to Angie's voice on the line, nervous, telling Ben that she'd let a man in to use the bathroom and the phone. We now know who that man was. He was Donald Bess, a paroled serial rapist, a stranger, standing in her apartment while she made a phone call she thought was ordinary. This is the detail that makes the Samota case so uniquely haunting, and it's why it's stayed with so many people for so long. There was no forced entry in the way we usually imagine it. There was a knock and a request that sounded reasonable and harmless. A man saying he needed to use the phone, needed the restroom. And Angie, who was by every account a kind and decent person, did the kind and decent thing. She opened the door. In that era, before the reflexive caution that later generations grew up with, letting a stranger use your phone was not the unthinkable act it might seem now. It was, on its face, a small courtesy. And a predator turned that courtesy into an opportunity. And here is the almost unbearable piece. Even after she'd let him in, even with him inside, Angie sensed that something was wrong. That's what the phone call was. Some instinct told her the situation was off, and she reached out. She called Ben. She let her voice carry the nervousness. She said she'd call right back. In another version of that night, maybe that call is the thing that saves her. Maybe Ben gets there in time. Maybe she finds a way out. But the man had already decided what he was going to do, and there was no time between that call and the violence. Her instinct was right. It just couldn't outrun him. I dwell on this not to make the horror worse, but because it's the human center of the case. Angie's kindness was not a mistake. It was a virtue that a monster exploited. The failure was never hers. It belonged entirely to the man she let in, and to a parole decision that put a serial predator back on the street in the first place. Donald Bess was charged with the capital murder of Angela Samota, and his case went to trial in 2010, 26 years after the night she died. At the center of the case was the DNA, the genetic evidence Angie had fought to leave behind, now finally readable with technology that simply had not existed in 1984. The forensic connection between Bess and the murder was clear, and in the end, unanswerable. The jury convicted him, and for the murder of Angela Samota, Donald Bess was sentenced to death. It was, by one account, the only cold case in Dallas that year to result in a death sentence, a measure of both the brutality of the crime and the strength of the evidence that Sheila's persistence had finally forced into the light. Bess would go on to spend his remaining years on death row, filing appeals, including one the state's highest criminal court rejected in 2016. He never got an execution date. He died on death row of a heart attack in October of 2022, still awaiting the sentence the court had handed him. There is a piece of this ending that deserves to be honored. Angie's mother, Betty Ruth Samota, lived long enough to see it. She had lost her youngest child in the most horrific way imaginable, and had waited more than a quarter of a century, most of it with no answer at all. But she was still alive when the man who took her daughter was named, tried, and sentenced. She died in 2021, at the age of 96, having lived to see justice arrive, however late. Not every mother in these stories gets that. She did, and it matters. And then there is Sheila. When Bess was convicted, Sheila Wysocki, the roommate who had built a war room, made herself a private investigator, and refused to let the case die, did not feel the clean sense of closure people expect. She has said as plainly as anyone ever has that a conviction does not undo a murder. There was, she said, no real closure, because closure isn't a thing a verdict can give back. She retired her PI license, having done the one thing she'd gotten it for. But it didn't stay retired for long. Because once people learned what she'd done, how one determined woman had forced a 26-year-old murder to be solved, they started coming to her. Other families, other unsolved cases, people with their own Angies, asking for help. And Sheila couldn't say no. She is, to this day, a working private investigator specializing in cold cases. Angie's murder made her one. And through her, Angie's death has helped pull other families' answers out of the dark. The murder of Angela Samota leaves us with a few truths worth carrying out of it. The first is about the evidence itself, and it's a theme this whole channel keeps returning to. Angie's killer left his DNA behind in 1984, and it named him in 2008. Nothing about the evidence changed in those 24 years. What changed was the science's ability to read it, and, just as importantly, whether anyone was still trying. The DNA was patient. It sat in an evidence room and waited, exactly as it was, until the world caught up. That is the quiet promise underneath every case we cover. Physical evidence doesn't forget, doesn't age, doesn't lose its nerve. It simply waits for the tools, and for the people, to give it a voice. The second truth is about the wrong man. For years, an innocent person lived under the shadow of this murder, and the single result that finally named Donald Bess, also, in the same instant, cleared Russell Buchanan completely. This is one of the most important things forensic DNA has given us, and it gets far less attention than the arrests. It is as good at proving innocence as it is at proving guilt. Every real killer it identifies is, very often, an innocent person it simultaneously frees. Justice isn't only about catching the right person, it's about uncatching the wrong one. But the deepest truth of this case is not about the science at all. It's about Sheila Wysocki. Because the hard reality is that the DNA could have sat in that evidence room forever. The technology existed by the 2000s, yes, but technology doesn't test itself. Someone has to pull the file. Someone has to demand it. Someone has to refuse to let a 20-year-old murder stay buried under the weight of everything else a police department is drowning in. And in this case, that someone was not a detective or a prosecutor. It was a grieving best friend who loved Angie enough to reshape her own entire life around getting her justice. Sheila proved something that ought to give every family with a cold case a measure of hope, that sometimes the thing standing between an unsolved murder and an answer is not a missing piece of evidence at all. It's a missing person who refuses to give up. Angela Samota was 20 years old, a brilliant young woman in a field ahead of its time, a devoted friend, a kind soul whose kindness a predator turned against her. She should have had all of it, the career, the decades, the ordinary life. She was robbed of every bit of that on a single October night, but she was not forgotten, because one person would not allow it. And in the end, the DNA she fought to leave behind, and the friend who fought for 26 years to give it a voice, together did what the world had failed to do for far too long. They named the man who killed her. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe, because the next one is already waiting.